coming. It's coming. Good evening, everybody. We're about to get started. It's time to get our program started. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. It is great to have you here on such a beautiful spring evening. To have the weather turn and not be cold. I think last time we had an event here, it was in March and it was still cold. So it is, I know I feel so much better knowing that I don't have to put a coat on every day. So that's nice. So again, thank you all for being here. My name is Jim Lakely. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Heartland Institute. I see a lot of new faces, so indulge me for a moment to tell you a little bit about what the Heartland Institute is. We are a free market, libertarian/conservative think tank, founded in 1984 in Chicago by a lot of economists who got together and said, the Cato Institute and there's other think tanks in Washington, D.C. that do a lot of great work over there, but we need one here in the heartland of America to do that work too, to help spread the message of liberty. And we do that. We do that in many ways. One of the things that we're really known for is our work with state legislators. We work directly with states. We're kind of like paratroopers. We'll fly over the country, and then we'll see a flare go up in Kansas, and down we go to help out with them on public policy issues and fighting for things like school choice and education policy. We just deal with domestic stuff, budgets and taxes. Of course, we want, in general, balanced budgets and much lower taxes and pro-growth policies. We do work in healthcare, where we opposed Obamacare, and we're part of the coalition that almost got it defeated. And we are certainly supporting the dismantling of that socialized medicine as it's happening right now. But we're probably most known globally for our work in environment and climate issues. We've put on 12 international conferences on climate change that have attracted more than, I think, almost 300 different speakers, scientists from around the world, that give the scientific evidence that humans are not causing a climate crisis. And we're attacked mercilessly about that by the media and by professional leftist organizations. The Sierra Club, which I think outspends us by probably a factor of 200 or 500. Their budget is enormous. They are scared whenever Heartland gets involved in something because they know that we are effective and are giving them a run for their money. And then there's another new project. Thank you. I heard a "you are" very quiet. Say that louder next time. Okay. And then there's another kind of newer project that we have going on right now. It's called Stopping Socialism. One of Heartland's editors. Yeah, that's right. Needed now more than ever, as a matter of fact. We started this project before the 2018 election, and the 2018 election just fell right into our hands with the people that got elected to Congress. So we couldn't have had better timing. One of Heartland's editors, named Justin Haskins, he wrote a book called Socialism is Evil, which gets right to the point. And he kind of heads up this project with us again, it's great for the core mission of the Heartland Institute, which is to advance liberty and small government and free markets, which is the complete opposite of what socialism is all about. Justin has been on a media tour de force over the last several months. He was on the Glenn Beck program, 2 times in 4 days to talk about socialism is evil. And as a matter of fact, Glenn Beck contacted him just the other day and said, I need to come down to Dallas. We're doing a whole series of shows opposing socialism, and you got to be a part of it. So he's flying down there soon to do those. So if you are yes, how about a round of applause for that fantastic coup? So if you subscribe to the Blaze TV or CRTV, like I did, and now they're combined, you'll be able to see Justin on there doing that. He's been on Tucker Carlson Tonight a couple times, Fox and Friends. Tomorrow, he's going to be on Varney and Company on the Fox Business Channel at about 11 a.m. Eastern, I think. But you'll know. You check your listings, and you'll see him on there, and he'll be talking again about stopping socialism. He's been on that program, I think, 6 times in the last 3 months or so. And anyone gets the One America News Network, or OWN, with Tipping Point with Liz Wheeler, they're practically going to charge him rent on that show at this point because he's on there so much, again, talking about socialism. And, there's a special, and actually the reason Justin's in the news is another thing that the Heartland Institute is working on, and that is fighting back against the censorship of conservative thought on social media platforms in America. Justin wrote a piece that was in foxnews.com about his experience having his account deplatformed by Facebook. He had spent money on ads through Facebook at least 100 times, promoting his writing and videos and podcasts on conservative ideas, conservative thought. Very straightforward, very mainstream. And then the Heartland Institute with him produced a video, short video, 2 minutes, 48 seconds, that were the closing remarks of a fantastic presentation he gave at Students for Liberty back in January, urging millennials to reject socialism and to embrace liberty. It was really, really inspiring. So inspiring that Facebook deleted his account for running advertisement for it. He got the runaround. He asked at least almost a dozen times, this does not violate your policy. Why did you take this down? And eventually Facebook got so tired of him asking questions, asking them to actually adhere to their actual terms of service, that they just said, this case is closed. Do not contact us anymore about this. This matter is settled. And that's it. Oh, and you're not going to be able to do Facebook ads anymore. Well, he wrote a column on that on the Fox News, foxnews.com. Within 24 hours, Facebook suddenly wanted to talk to Justin again about his account. He got on several programs to talk about it. He got a lot of publicity, and actually Facebook ended up calling us. I was on a call with one of Facebook's representatives who specializes in outreach to conservatives. If you need a specialist to talk to freedom lovers, maybe there's another problem that a specialist can't fix. But they assured us that this was all just some kind of misunderstanding. We're sorry. It'll be restored. It took another 24 hours, but it has been restored. But you shouldn't have to know a guy in Facebook's higher echelon to not be censored on Facebook or Twitter or anywhere else. And this is something the Heartland Institute's fighting for as well. We're on the front lines of that very important issue right now. As a matter of fact, our president, Tim Huelskamp, is going to a scheduled meeting among other think tanks and nonprofit groups on the right, like the Heartland Institute, to get organized, as the left likes to do, and to fight back as a unified front to make sure that free speech rules our social media platforms. Not censorship, not wokeness. If you can't handle the message, it's a you problem. That is not a problem of the Constitution and is not a problem of anything else. And so that's an extremely important project. And all of these things that Heartland does, both here in the Heartland, in Washington, D.C., and around the world, to advance liberty, to fight for free markets, is fighting for you, for our liberty, our freedom, our heritage, our legacy, is all done with the support of the supporters of the Heartland Institute. If you are not a donor to the Heartland Institute, I would hope after this program and other programs that you've seen of us around on YouTube, that you might consider becoming a supporter of the Heartland Institute. We need that support. I know there's a lot of supporters in this room. I see donors, and I recognize them, and I applaud you for all the people in this room that do support the Heartland Institute. But if you can find a way to do that as well, if you are as moved about these topics as we are and are impressed with the work we do, I hope you will consider doing so. You can also check out our podcasts, which I just did one with our speaker tonight, on iTunes. And if you have registered with iTunes, it'd be great if you left us a nice review, because the left is out there to ruin that as well. It's been downloaded more than 3.2 million times in 2018, and we're on pace for 4 million downloads this year, so that's a pretty extraordinary rate. And you can also volunteer with the Heartland Institute. There are some volunteers in this room. Some of the volunteers that we have at Heartland help put this room together for us and help bring this fantastic hot food. You guys came on a good night. Hot food tonight for our event. So there's lots of ways to get involved in the Heartland Institute. Just find anybody with a Heartland tag on their shirt, and they'll be happy to help you get more involved as well. With that, just one other thing, and I apologize for making it just, another thing. This gentleman over here, his name is Paul. He is from AM 560. AM 560, the Salem Radio Network, The Answer. Let's have a round of applause for that fantastic station. Heartland and AM 560 have partnered together on all sorts of different projects and events over the years, and we're proud that if you are going to be coming regularly this spring, you're going to see a table over here for a while. And so I hope you filled out one of those pieces of paper and dropped it into the fishbowl, because you are going to win, somebody is going to win at the end of the night, the mystery bag of stuff right there. I don't think there's any kind, it's a red bag. Does it have any commie stuff in it, or is it all freedom stuff? You know what? We'll find out. That's great. That's why it's a surprise bag. But thank you AM 560 for being here. Looking forward to having you here all spring and summer long. Our speaker tonight is a man named Larry Schweikart, and he has lived a very interesting life. After graduating from Arizona State University, he decided he'd go on the road with several different rock bands, opening for such now classic rock groups such as Steppenwolf. Then he abruptly decided that he wanted to become a history professor. And he received his master's from Arizona State University in history, and then a PhD in history from the University of California at Santa Barbara. From 1985 to 2016, he taught at the University of Dayton, and he actually continues to teach today at his website, wildworldofhistory.com. And that site, he not only teaches history, it's a fantastic site, he doesn't just teach history, he teaches you how to teach history, which is very important. So if you're a homeschooler, this is going to be a resource you will not want to skip by, and everyone should check it out. It's a fantastic, fantastic website. He's also written 25 books, including 7 Events That Made America, How Trump Won, and his #1 New York Times bestseller with Mike Allen, A Patriot's History of the United States. His latest book, which he's here to talk about tonight, goes on sale on May 7th, Reagan, the American President. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome to the stage at the Andrew Breitbart Freedom Center, Larry Schweikart.
Well, you should, if you don't already have one of these, I have a couple left I can give out. If you email me at larry@wildworldofhistory.com, I'll send you a free Reagan mini course, also a free how to teach history course. So let's see, are we ready to go here? I didn't flip it right. There we go. All right. So, yeah, it's been a fun ride. You know, I remember opening for Steppenwolf in Florida. I remember doing a flaming drum solo in which I almost turned the Yuma Convention Center into a fire pit that consumed everybody. I got into Ronald Reagan when I wrote 7 Events that made America America. This is not turning either way. Can you guys flip the thing for me? Wait, it just, there, okay, got it, okay, decided to work. And in that book, I looked not at the most important events that you would normally associate with U.S. history. I looked at 7 things I thought were really critical to our history that nobody knows about. One of those was Reagan's greatest mistake, which was Lebanon, 1983. And in that, I did a lot of research at the Reagan papers, and that led me to think, you know what, I could probably write a biography of this guy. And so the question comes up, well, why do we need another biography of Ronald Reagan? Well, a lot of reasons. First of all, the guy who had the best shot at writing the very best biography of Ronald Reagan, Edmund Morris, blew it totally. I mean, he screwed up top to bottom. He injected a fictional character of himself throughout the book, which calls into question every single other thing he wrote. You don't know what's true and what isn't. In addition, he spent a great deal of his time trying to figure out who Ronald Reagan really was. You know, who is this Ronald Reagan? Reagan told you who he was. Ronald Reagan was this guy. Okay, he bled red, white, and blue. He was the guy that you saw on screen. That was Ronald Reagan. He didn't keep his feelings all hidden to himself. And most of the men of my father's generation, which was Reagan's generation, were too busy achieving things and doing things to sit around contemplating their navel and worrying about their presidential library. And so the Reagan that you saw is the Reagan that you got. But most importantly, since about 2000, millions of papers have become available in the Reagan Presidential Library. And I think these tell the story of Ronald Reagan far better than one more interview with Ed Meese would ever do. And so I didn't spend a lot of time interviewing all the Reagan cronies, all the Reagan family. I did get to know Mike pretty well, but I spent all my time in the Reagan papers, and what emerged, I think, is quite a remarkable story. Let's back up one. Reagan, as a young man on the Rock River in Illinois, saved 77 people from drowning. Now, if he had done nothing else in his entire life, to me that would have qualified him as an American hero. And these were not fake saves. Some people later said, well, all those people weren't drowning. The ones that they could locate later and interview said, oh yeah, I was drowning. One woman was sucked underneath a log, another guy had been knocked out, on and on and on. So he was already on his way to becoming an American hero. He goes to Eureka College, that you probably already know. He wanted to be a football player. That was his goal in life. But his eyes were horrible. He couldn't see anything. And as a result, when he lined up, the only position he could play was lineman. Okay, you block that shape in front of you, all right? And he could do that pretty well. At Eureka, he had really bad grades, C average about, which is really what I had going through Arizona State the first time because I was busy playing rock and roll. I used to tell students in all my classes, don't tell your parents. Grades are not important, But Reagan would later quip, he went back to Eureka many years later for a honorary degree. And he looked at it and he said, I always thought the first one I got was honorary. Anyway, he does end up playing football. He has to ride the bench for a long time. He doesn't get in right away, and he's finally put into the lineup and becomes a football player. He also becomes our first and only student protest leader. Did you know that Ronald Reagan led a student protest at Eureka? Eureka was in financial trouble. They cut a number of classes for the seniors. In a separate, who knows why they did this kind of move, they banned a school dance. Now, Eureka was a Christian school, and they didn't allow dancing. But for some reason, they had this tradition of a single dance called the grind. And the grind looked like this. Guys stand facing this way. Girls stand inside facing that way, and they dance in opposite directions till the music stops. When the music stops, you're supposed to talk to the person opposite you. It's a good way to introduce all the students to each other. And I'm sure they threw in some twerking moves while they were at it, but at any rate, they banned the grind. And so the seniors call a meeting, 11 o'clock Friday night, ring the bell. Hundreds and hundreds of people come to this meeting, and they explain to them what's going on. They're canceling all of our classes, and they're canceling the grind. We want to stage a strike, a student walkout. But we seniors can't lead it because it would look too self-serving. We need a freshman. And everybody had heard about Reagan's speaking prowess and his work in the drama club. So Reagan gets elected to lead this student protest. Now here's the key. The protest starts on Thanksgiving weekend. It's really going to start as soon as they get back. So they had to maintain the interest and the energy and the zeal all the way through a week-long Thanksgiving break. When they come back, they take a poll, how many students are going to go out on strike? All but 6 agreed to go out on strike, and 2 of those were the president's daughters. So he wins this student protest, which is kind of ironic given that one of his 2 or 3 biggest issues in California is student protesters, okay? Reagan gets his first job as an announcer for a radio station in Iowa doing Chicago Cubs baseball. But of course, they're in Iowa, and you may know this, the Cubs are actually in Chicago. I don't know if you guys knew that, So he wasn't watching the games live. He would get a ticker tape of the play-by-play, and he would dramatize it and embellish it and make it look just as, it's a warm day here at Wrigley Field. And he'd go on and on like that. Well, one day the ticker tape stops right in the middle of a game. And Reagan has to ad-lib for almost 7 full minutes, and so he has the guy foul off like 100 balls. He fouls off. Oh, this is a long foul ball. And he has a picture, the catcher shake off. Pitcher shakes off like 300 calls. No, he shakes off another. He steps off the mound. He pulls his cap off. He spits out his tobacco. On and on and on. Till finally the ticker tape started up again. It turns out the guy had flied out on the first pitch. So he had to make something up. He goes with the Cubs to California for spring training, and a friend from Dixon had arranged for him to get a audition with 2 different movie studios, one of which was Warner Brothers. So he does a screen test. But he has to go back to Iowa for his job. So he's on the train, he goes back to Iowa, he gets off the train, and the guy says, son, I've got a telegram here for you. And it was his agent. And his agent said, Warner Brothers wants to sign you X number of years at Y number of dollars. I forget the dollars. Reagan goes into the telegraph office and he says, he sends a message to his agent, sign quick before they change their minds, right? So he goes out to California to become an actor. And wait a minute, we keep jumping these. Okay, there we go. He becomes an actor. And as an actor, Reagan was not a great actor, folks. And the reason Reagan was not a great actor is Ronald Reagan did not want to be a great actor. He would never say that. But if you look at how Heath Ledger or Christian Bale throw themselves into roles where they literally will, look at Gary Oldman as Churchill. You couldn't even recognize that's Gary Oldman. Reagan would never do that. He would never throw himself into a role like that, with 2 exceptions. First of all, he gets his part, Newt Rockne, All-American. And in that, what does he play? A football player. He knows football. He can do that. And, of course, he plays George Gipp, who makes the famous deathbed statement when the boys are up against it, tell him to go out there and win just one for the Gipper. So his nickname becomes the Gipper. He already had a nickname, which was Dutch, because when he was born, he had a red face, and his father said he looks like a little Dutchman. So now, and he struggled actually with what to call himself in Hollywood, whether it was Ron Reagan, Ronald Reagan. He experimented with all sorts of different accents and so forth till he finally just settled on who he was. But he's already developing an intellectual approach to things. He's becoming intellectual, and he's studying history, he's studying economics, probably more than he ever did when he was at Eureka. And he is boring the hell out of his fellow actors. They don't want to see Reagan coming on a lunch break because he's going to sit there and talk politics and talk economics. Oh my gosh, we want to gossip. What's this guy doing? So, and same thing happened with his wife, Jane Wyman. Reagan really drove her away because he was interested in politics and economics, and all Jane was interested in was her next part. So Reagan is nominated by Jane to be on the Screen Actors Guild board, and he soon becomes the president of Screen Actors Guild, or SAG. All right, pop question. We've only had 2 presidents who've been acting members of SAG, Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. So Reagan, as head of SAG, finds out something very unpleasant. There are commies all over SAG. Every place you look, there's a commie behind the bench. They're everywhere inside the union, more so than in the rank and file. But in the leadership, there's a lot of communists. And I'm not talking old line socialists. I'm talking real Ocasio-Cortez, occasional Cortex commies, okay? My nickname for her on Twitter is Dead Eyes. You ever see Jaws? You ever see Jaws? That scene where they're talking in the boat and the shark's hitting, and he goes, I went down to the Indianapolis and the sharks come. You ever seen a shark's eyes? Dead eyes. That's Ocasio-Cortez. You look at her and nothing there, right? So anyway, Reagan, as head of SAG, tries to purge the communists from SAG, and they have a real battle there. He goes to an after meeting at Olivia de Havilland's house. And it's him, Olivia de Havilland, William Holden, and Jimmy Roosevelt. And Reagan's just standing there looking at Olivia de Havilland the whole time like this, and she's looking at him like this. Finally, she comes over and says, why are you looking at me like that? And he says, well, I always thought you were one of them. And she said, well, I always thought you were one of them too. So that's how insidious it was. Anyway, he is asked to go testify on behalf of SAG to Congress in the HUAC hearings, House Un-American Affairs Committee hearings. And they've been told this guy doesn't like communists and he's going to be really forceful. So they're expecting him to come in and support all these kind of crackdowns on free speech. And Reagan stuns them. He says, I think we've gotten rid of almost all the communists in our unions, and I would never, ever want to see an abridgment of freedom of speech in our country. I'd never want to see any censorship take root. And then he quotes Thomas Jefferson to the Congress. I mean, that's horrible. That's like showing the vampire the cross, Thomas Jefferson to Congress. So he's a big hit there. After his acting career pretty much flames out, I mentioned Newt Rockne, All-American. The other role where he really, really nailed it, of course, was King's Row. And in King's Row, he played a wealthy young man who lost all his money and was in love with a doctor's daughter. He was working in the railroad yards when 2 trains crushed his legs, and they take him to this doctor. And instead of fixing his legs, the doctor amputates them. And that's the scene where Reagan wakes up from anesthesia and says, where's the rest of me? It turns out he shot that on one take. He was so good in doing that. So after his star begins to fade in Hollywood, he takes a job with General Electric. And his job is twofold. One, he hosts a weekly show called General Electric Theater, and then every so often, once a month, he will star in one of the General Electric Theater shows. And people just came to that like crazy. All the top actors, Spencer Tracy, and all of them came to be on GE Theater because they could choose their roles, and they frequently chose roles that were against their type. So if they're always a hero, they would get to play a villain on General Electric Theater. The other part of his work, though, was that he was required to go around and make speeches to the General Electric factory workforce all over the country. And that's where he develops the 3x5 cards, because he would go into these and just mark down 2 or 3 things he wanted to talk about, and then he would open up to questions. And, of course, the questions for an actor were really pretty good. But one time he was speaking to a group of all women, and this is his words, not mine. A bull of a woman came up to him and said, Buster, I'd like to back you into a corner. And Reagan said, well, it'd have to be a pretty big corner. So he develops his ideology, his intellect, through the General Electric speeches. He learns how to talk to ordinary people. And he is an intellectual, and I think one of the reasons he's not considered an intellectual is he always uses a $1 word instead of a $10 word. Right? He always talks right to people. In 1964, he's asked to give a speech, 1-hour televised speech, Time for Choosing, on behalf of candidate for president Barry Goldwater. And this is where he doesn't initiate or invent the phrase rendezvous with destiny there, but that's really where he makes it. He'd been using that for some time. But he gives this speech, and all the GOP bigwigs look at each other when they're done. They go, we nominated the wrong guy, And so he's then encouraged to run for governor of California. It's very interesting. When he starts to run for governor of California, the great concern about him was, he knows the national issues. He knows foreign policy. He doesn't know enough about California. And they had to brief him on California because he had been so occupied with bigger picture issues. He hadn't really paid a lot of attention to California issues. The other thing I found in my research that no one else has really looked at is that the guy who makes Ronald Reagan governor of California is his brother, Neil. Neil Reagan was an advertising executive who had extensive contacts throughout California and the country, but the very wealthy guys in California, he got them to back Reagan's run for the presidency. Something else you might not have known, Reagan was afraid to fly. So as he's getting ready to run for the governorship, he's in Northern California, he gets a call from Neil. Do you want to be governor? Well, yes, I do. Well, then you need to be at a meeting of the Coconut Grove tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock because I have all these donors here. He goes, well, I'd have to fly. And Neil said, do you want to be governor? And hung up. Reagan was there the next day, and after that, he seemed to have no more problem flying. As governor of California, of course, I mentioned the student protests. He had to deal with a number of issues. We don't have time to get into all those. But I really enjoyed how he dealt with the student protests. He was very firm, but he could also use humor a lot. In one instance, he was in Sacramento, and the students staged a massive, not sit in or stand in, they were just going to stand there and everybody be quiet, not say a word. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students are just going to stand there like this. Well, Reagan was supposed to be gone when this happened, but he found out about it. He says, turn the car around. We're going to go back. So he goes back, and he walks through all these students. When he gets to the top, he goes, shh. And they all cracked up. They all started laughing. Another time, he was at Santa Barbara, where I went to school, had really serious violence. I mean, they burned down the Bank of America. A student got shot and died from a ricochet. It was really, really bad. And Reagan is visiting Santa Barbara, and there's crowds out there, mobs, yelling and screaming. And this one bearded guy is up next to his window, and he's going, "We are the future! We are the future!" Reagan gets out a piece of paper, and he quickly scribbles on it, "I'll sell my bonds." He runs for president in 1976. This is his second run. Do you know that they thought he was too old when he ran in 68? He was trying to run a draft Reagan movement, but they said, you're too old for this. Well, they really thought he was too old in 1976. Every member of his family opposed that run. He ran against everybody else's advice, came within 100 delegates of beating a sitting incumbent president. How hard is that, right? And once again, after the convention, the brass looks at each other and they go, "We nominated the wrong guy again." But fortunately, the winner of the general election was Jimmy Carter. In my book, you'll see that I have a chapter called "The Worst President Ever." There's an asterisk next to it. At the bottom of the page, "Until Barack Obama." Carter was just a disaster on so many levels, and what I found most of all was that Carter consistently blamed the American people for his failings. It was your fault things weren't working out, not his. And he, like everyone did of Reagan and like they do of Trump, he constantly underestimated Reagan. And early on, he used almost the same words about Reagan that would be used about Trump. "That's the guy we want to run against." Well, you got your wish. At any rate, Reagan led most of that campaign until the very end, around October, and then he fell behind a couple of points in the polls, and his pollster was very concerned about that. And he said, "I think you need to do something. You need to take up Carter on his invitation to debate." So this was the latest debate in presidential history. It was the Saturday before the final weekend and the election on Tuesday. And of course, Reagan wins it with 5 words. "Well, there you go again." That's all it took. When he totally disarmed Carter, took away all of Carter's supposedly superior knowledge of all of the little intricate facts, and Reagan won in such a landslide that that Carter puts in a call early to California. The polls weren't even closed in California. Reagan's still in the shower, and Nancy comes up. She goes, "It's Jimmy Carter." And Reagan's standing there dripping, and Carter basically concedes the election. So Reagan comes in. He has a holistic view of policies. Defeating the Soviet Union and the American economy are two sides of the same coin to Ronald Reagan. As America gets better, evil gets worse. As America does well, our enemies do worse. And he saw that in everything he did. So one of his first acts was to ensure that tall Paul Volcker, the 6'7" head of the Federal Reserve, stayed on. And he said, "Go for it, Paul." He says, "Cut inflation. Get rid of inflation." Now, many people in here, I think, are old enough to remember we had home mortgage rates of 10, 11, 12%. We had credit card rates of 25, 26%. Inflation was just absolutely out of control. Volcker squeezed inflation down to 0 in 1 quarter in 1982, an astounding feat. And I'm going to show you in just a minute how that worked on the other side of the coin to really knock off the Soviets. Of course, Reagan believed in winning the Cold War and set out to do just that. That's amazing, because no other president up till then had thought about winning the Cold War. They all wanted to manage it, have mutual assured destruction. And one other thing I found that was interesting is that very early, far earlier than most people think, Reagan was committed to totally abolishing nuclear weapons. He wanted to get rid of all nuclear weapons, but he thought to do that he had to bring the Soviets to heel. Carter had canceled the B-1 bomber, the MX missile, refused to deploy the cruise missiles, had not deployed the anti-ballistic missile system. The only thing he couldn't stop was the Trident submarine, because that had been started and was so far along he couldn't cancel it. And here Reagan, like all great leaders, has luck. He has good luck. The Trident goes into the water, the USS Ohio, as it were, goes into the water in March 1981, right after Reagan takes office. And our anti-submarine warfare ships are all over. They're trying to find it. We got planes, we got subs, we got sub-chasers, we got everybody. They can't find it. They go, Mr. President, we got a problem. We got a sub out there and we can't find it. He goes, so what's the problem? It's ours, isn't it? You know? And so when they finally reestablished contact, that meant that we could put one of these things in a Soviet harbor and they wouldn't know it. As luck would have it, when I'm teaching at my first job, which was at the University of Wisconsin, Richland Center, better known as hell, my roommate was a boomer sailor. He'd been on a boomer. And so I'm talking to him about all this stuff. I'd written back in the 80s a book on the Trident submarine. I says, it's what I said in here, is that right? You know, he goes, yeah, every word you said was right. That's right. They couldn't find our stuff. He says, but you know what? We knew exactly where their stuff was. Our listening systems were so good, he said, we could not only tell when a Soviet ship or sub left port in the Baltic from America, we could tell what ship it was, the USS or the USSR Lenin, okay? They could tell the name of the ship. That was how good these guys were. So we were way ahead of them in these kinds of weapons. So Reagan immediately begins this buildup. Now, to Reagan, he understood things, as I said, holistically. He understood that the Soviets export only 4 things: vodka, oil, gold, and spies. And so he set out to undercut the gold. How did he do that? Volcker brings inflation down to 0. That causes the value of a gold ingot to fall tenfold in the first couple of Reagan's years. It means they couldn't sell their gold for any money anymore. They were being starved of cash. Then one of his very first meetings with a foreign dignitary is the oil minister of the Saudi Arabia. And he says, now, you guys are going to start pumping more oil and you're going to lower the price of oil. It wasn't a request, right? And so he said, what will you give us for? He'd go, we'll give you some AWACS airplanes, but you're going to lower the price of oil. And so he did. It was very controversial. The Israelis did not want us selling AWACS to the Arabs, but he said we needed that to lower the price of oil. Reagan went on a moral offensive. He called Soviet Union the evil empire. He forges this alliance with Pope John Paul II to get many, many hostages, religious hostages, out of Russia. One of the most impressive groups he got out were the Siberian 7, who were Pentecostals, who were engaged in a starvation diet protest inside the U.S. Embassy, couldn't be let out of the country. And Reagan sent through word. He says, look, if you guys will let them out, I won't say a word about it. I won't crow about it. We won't talk about it. It'll just be quiet, but these people get to go free. Sure enough, they got to go free. So he cements this religious alliance with Pope John Paul II. Reagan understood, I think, better than most people know, the value of rock and roll and the value of culture. And he increased funding for Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, which was beaming into Europe rock and roll music. And this was a big fight. I interviewed Joe Morris, a Chicagoan here, who introduced me last time I talked at Heartland. And Morris was on the legal team of Voice of America. And he said there were knockdown, drag-out fights about whether or not to blast rock and roll music in. But it was key that we do that. And here's the reason. Whether you understand the lyrics or not, whether you like the lyrics or not, rock and roll music is a music of freedom. Did you know rock and roll is the only cultural art form we have that has never been subsidized by the government? In fact, the governments have tried to stop it and so did the Soviets. The Soviets, I'm not kidding, created a ministry of rock. Does that sound like something Jack Black would star in, Jack Black and the Ministry of Rock? And they gave subsidies to rock and roll musicians who would sing pro-Soviet, pro-communist stuff. It didn't work very well. So we start blasting in rock and roll. Rock and roll is a music of freedom. Same with blues, jazz, country, they are all off that same tree. But what do you have in every rock song? Every rock song starts the same way with a group. It ends the same way as a group. And what's in the middle? The solo. You see, folks, it's a picture of America. We do things together, but you never do lose your individuality. And this came through whether they could understand the lyrics, the English, or not. We talked to a record collector from Romania who paid $150 for one album, Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme. And we got the Utes out there today whining that it costs $1.49 on iTunes to download a song, right? This guy paid $150 for one album. I interviewed a Hungarian rock and roller, student activist protester, who had to leave Hungary. He escaped via a train tunnel to Austria, named Leslie Mandoki. And Mandoki went on to great fame and prominence in Europe as a producer. He did all the original music for Audi and Volkswagen. He got to be so big, he hung out with Bill Clinton and Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev comes to his home one day, and they start talking about rock and roll, and he said, Gorbachev tells Leslie, this is a quote, rock and roll music was fundamental to bringing down the Iron Curtain. So it's really interesting that in 1988, just as Reagan's about to go out, the East German communists have a concert, and they invite Bruce Springsteen, big leftist, right? So they think he's going to get up there and really say nasty things about Ronald Reagan. And Springsteen plays two songs, and then he says, I'm not here to praise or condemn any political system or talk about democracy or communism or anything like that. I'm just here to play music. And they go, oh, we have screwed up big time. This is terrible. So then he launches into his most famous song, which is Born in the USA. Now, if you know the lyrics, if you've read them, it's an anti-Vietnam War song. But nobody knows this because nobody can understand a word Springsteen says. He's like Mick Jagger, I've been down to the hill. What? I've been going to the USA. Say what? Born in the U.S. Oh, they got that. So here are 80,000 communist Utes out there going, born in the U.S., and the commissars, oh, they screwed up so bad, And Leslie told us they wanted to be Americans. It wasn't just that they liked Americans, they wanted to be Americans. Reagan also formed an alliance with Lech Walesa, the Polish labor leader, began fomenting revolution from below. This is something Eisenhower did not do. This is something Nixon did not do. But for the first time, he's actually supporting these groups that are trying to weaken communism at the very bottom. He uses a Texas congressman named Charlie Wilson to funnel weapons to the Afghan mujahideen who are fighting the Russians in Afghanistan. And this was amazing because you had to use Russian weapons at first. Later on, we just sent our own stuff. But at first, we were trying to keep up the pretense that we were not supporting the Afghans. So we had to get Russian weapons. We had to buy them with American dollars from the Israelis, who sent the Russian weapons to the Saudis to be packaged in boxes that didn't have the Star of David on it, so they could be sent to the Pakistanis, who then toted it over the hill to the Afghans. And Charlie Wilson was a great help in this. He's one of the few guys, I think he looks better than the guy who played him in the movies. I think he's more handsome than Tom Hanks. I wish I looked like Charlie Wilson. He had, of course, his best alliance was with Margaret Thatcher. It wasn't without pits and valleys. They had a big fight over the Falklands War. They had a big fight over the invasion of Grenada, which Reagan did not tell her was coming. He just went in first and told her later. But they always patched it up, and she was the only woman, other than Nancy, who could call Ronald Reagan her Ronnie. But then kind of the cherry on top, the straw that breaks the camel's back, is when Reagan does a defense speech in 1983, and he adds a section on that he won't show anyone else. Like 3 or 4 people saw this. Schultz didn't see it. Nancy didn't see it. Nobody else saw this section of the speech in which he urges Americans to start a national engineering research and development program to shoot down ballistic missiles, a defense against ballistic missiles. The press did him the greatest favor of his career. They call it Star Wars. Now, when I was growing up, if you wanted to ridicule something or make it seem ridiculous, you called it Buck Rogers, right? Because there's old Buck flying around outer space without even a good old space mask. He's breathing good old space air, you know. And this is my favorite. He's got the Swiss Army knife version of an alien-killing weapon here. This weapon, you can kill the alien, then go unplug your toilet at the same time. It's a super weapon. But the difference was that between Buck Rogers and 1983, everybody had seen us put a man on the moon. And by the way, if you've not seen Apollo 11, you need to go see Apollo 11, greatest movie of the year. We put a man on the moon. We put shuttles up. We used lasers, okay? We had done all this stuff, so it wasn't far out. And probably most important, almost all Americans had either seen or knew about the movie Star Wars. And in the movie Star Wars, the evil emperor was... It's the same guy. I think he auditioned for the role. So, if the evil emperor was Brezhnev or one of those guys, then Reagan was Luke. Yeah, there's an age difference, but they both have that jaunty, chin out kind of, we can take on the Death Star, come on, let's go, we'll beat them, right? And then that meant that Gorbachev was Darth. But see, you always think of Darth with a helmet, but when you take his helmet off, he looks just like Gorby. Put on the glasses, you know. They even have the same little red spot on their head. And by the way, in the Cold War, whenever the Soviets were about to invade somebody, Gorbachev's little birthmark took on the map shape of that country. You could tell where they're going. Oh, he's going to go into Georgia now, I can tell you. Watch out, it's Afghanistan. I can prove it. I can prove it. Because after the Soviet Union fell, his little red birthmark almost went away. But it started coming back when Putin went into Crimea, and Crimea's on his head. So you can always tell where the Soviets or Russians are going based on old Gorby's birthmark. So, in 1988, Reagan makes the last big foreign trip of his presidency. He goes to Moscow at the invitation of Mikhail Gorbachev. And he really goes for 2 reasons. One is to talk politics and the arms race and all that. But the other reason he goes is he's going to try to convert Mikhail Gorbachev to Christianity. And the first thing he does when he makes his first speech is he starts talking about God. God, 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 God. Or if you're a Pentecostal, God. And Jesus, it's 3 syllables in Pentecostal language. But he starts talking about God. You have to understand, in the Soviet Union, no one had spoken of God publicly in 60 years. And here's this president talking about it all the time. He gets Gorby aside and he says, Mikhail, how's your relationship with God? And Gorbachev's taken aback. He says, well, I was baptized as a child, but of course I'm a communist. I was raised as an atheist. And he keeps hammering, he keeps talking to him about it. Reagan gets back home and he tells one of his aides, you know, I think he's seriously thinking about his eternal life now, which is kind of amazing. Okay, let's go. Come on, there we go. Oh. So you've probably seen Reagan in his riding gear. What's interesting about this is the first time he was asked to come out for a picture in his riding gear, he comes out like this. English jodhpurs, an English saddle, which is how he rode a lot of the time. And the photographer's going crazy. No, man, we need the cowboy. Go back, change. So he goes back, dutifully changes into jeans and a cowboy hat and comes back out and does that. So it's very touching and sad that after he announces he has Alzheimer's, one of the few things he really continues to enjoy is writing. And did you know that those Secret Service agents had to make jumps? If he was doing jumps like over a fence, they had to jump too. And one time he said, I'm not going to jump anymore. And the Secret Service man said, thank you. Well, so he's out riding, and he has some trouble with his horse. And after they're done, John Barletta, his Secret Service agent, comes in and goes, Mrs. Reagan, he had some trouble out there. He's got to stop writing. She said, well, you're going to have to tell him, John. So Barletta goes in and he says, now watch the wording of this. He says, Mr. President, we had some trouble out there, didn't we? And Reagan said, no, John, I had trouble out there today. He wouldn't let Barletta be a part of the problem. And he says, Mr. President, I don't think you should write anymore. And Reagan stood up and puts his hands on Barletta's shoulder and says, that's all right, John, I know. At the time he's getting some of the worst news of his life, he's trying to console the guy bringing him the worst news of his life. When he died, it was a staggering testimony to Reagan that an entire city turned out at the Reagan Library to see him there. Then his body was sent back to Washington to be viewed in state. Hundreds of thousands of people who knew they would never get in time to see the body, nevertheless waited for days to see him. And so after going through so much under Carter, so much inflation, so many concerns about the Soviet Union, it's kind of fitting that his last most monumental testament there at the library is the big section of the Berlin Wall. And in the end, after 8 years of Ronald Reagan, the American people went out there and won one more for the Gipper.
Another round of applause. That was one of the greatest presentations we've ever had in this place. All right.
You're still not. Well, you're
No,
barely.
I'm on. I just need to speak louder, that's all. Here we go. All right. Great. So now we have time for Q&A, and I'm sure there's going to be quite a few of them. Because we're live streaming this, we need you to speak into the microphone when you have a question. So just raise your hand, and Lindsay will be working this side of the room. Keely will be working this side of the room. So who wants the first question? They can put their hand up.
Don't be shy.
All right. Right here.
Well, I would certainly echo the sentiments of our moderator. A sterling presentation, and if your book is half as interesting as your talk,
More interesting.
It'll be a very enjoyable read. So, in the interest of openness and honesty, I'm a die-in-the-wool conservative.
Okay.
Consider Ronald Reagan to be our greatest president since Abraham Lincoln. But one of the great things about our side is that we're not afraid to challenge some of the orthodoxies. Right. We don't sort of march in lockstep like the other side. So I'd like to throw out two challenges, two of the things that perhaps disturbed me the most about Ronald Reagan's presidency. And
I can add a third one that you haven't thought of, but go ahead.
I'm sure you could. So you mentioned SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. So one of the things that I always found a little bizarre about that was his offer to share the technology with the Soviet Union. As an aside, I once had a conversation with Richard Pearl, who, as you know, was instrumental in the Reagan Defense Department. I said, what's that all about? And he said to me in a sort of very incisive way, frankly, I don't have a clue. The other thing was Lebanon. As tragically, we lost, I think, over 283 of some of our best men, our Marines,
73 French.
in the barracks there. And you know, the question was, why were we keeping the peace when there was no peace to keep? And then after that, it seems to me that his reaction to pull out the troops had a very adverse effect, very negative repercussions, because it sent the wrong signals to all of our enemies.
We just talked about this on the podcast that we did. So let me take Lebanon first. Lebanon was in turmoil. They'd been kidnapping Americans over there already, groups like Hezbollah and so forth. And then the president of Lebanon's assassinated, the Israelis move in, the various militia groups from the Muslims move in, the Lebanese move in. There's like 7 armies fighting each other in Lebanon. And Caspar Weinberger was desperately against putting in any troops. But George Shultz thought that it would be possible to put in troops and separate the combatants. Subsequent research in all areas, not just Lebanon, shows that peacekeepers do not work unless there's already peace in place, unless the warring parties decided they want peacekeepers there. These guys did not. And I totally agree with you. In my chapter, 7 Events That Made America American, in the chapter in the book, I talk about how none other than Osama bin Laden pointed to that withdrawal out of Lebanon, and the twin explosions, which wasn't the 2 towers. This is, of course, before that. It was the barracks and the French paratrooper barracks where 73 French died. Now, SDI, Reagan repeatedly took a leaf from Eisenhower's book and Truman, where there was originally this idea that we can have nuclear weapons and we'll put them in the hands of the UN, or we'll share them internationally. Reagan did have a romantic, idealistic streak. Had it actually come to that, I think that he would have clamped down so hard on the technicalities it never would have worked. But it is one of those published, funny things. I think he also knew the Soviets would never, ever go for it. So that was kind of easy.
Okay, great. We're going to have a question over here. Is that right? Oh, of course, Mark.
Okay, you can hold the microphone. Mark Weiermiller. I am sharing this on Facebook, so people that are watching on Facebook, please share it. I have a quicker comment. I saw Reagan twice. I drove in his motorcade once in 1980 as a student volunteer. My dad met him once. I think he's the greatest president of all time, until Donald Trump. And I wondered what your opinion is. Is Donald Trump or Ronald Reagan the greatest president of all time?
Well, I would never put it. My top 4 are George Washington, because no one could do the job like Washington did, because not only did he do the job nearly perfectly, he did it with everybody else in mind coming down the pike, and he kept thinking, if I do it this way, the next guy might take it that way. So Washington's number 1, Lincoln's number 2, Reagan's number 3 in my book, Calvin Coolidge is number 4, but let's give Trump a little time. If he finishes 8 years like he's done the first 2.5, he might have to move up to number 3. I don't know. I might have to find a way to squeeze him in there. There is an appendix in the book, the comparisons of Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan and the similarities. You know, they were both the oldest man to enter office at the time they were elected, both divorced. Both had adult children while they were in the White House. As I said before, both were the only holders of a SAG card. Both had almost extensive, you could say most of their career was outside of politics. If you look at Reagan's life, probably had more years outside of politics than he did inside of politics. And the same with Trump. Both were hated by the media. And that kind of brings me to another thing we really didn't have time to get into in our talk, and that is the different styles. Reagan was not Trump and Trump was not Reagan. I submit to you that Ronald Reagan would have a great deal of trouble today. I don't think he could get elected, because Ronald Reagan was Muhammad Ali. He was the puncher. He would just, inside the boxing ring, he could not be beat. But we don't fight inside a boxing ring today. We fight inside one of those cage matches, right? And Trump is a cage match fighter. He knows how to go for the jugular. And the same way that I don't think FDR, who was the master of radio, would have been who he was in the age of television, because his polio would have shown up, and that would have affected people. And Lincoln could never have been FDR on radio, because he had a high, screechy voice like this and talked like that, and nobody would want to listen to that. So each man was uniquely positioned, I think, by God, put right in the right place at the right time of our history to save our republic.
If you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll get over to you. And while we're waiting for a hand to go up, Larry, I have actually a question. I want you to talk a little bit about Reykjavik, a little more about that. Again, we talked about this on the podcast on how, the media were killing Reagan on Reykjavik. You blew it. They were already worried he was going to hit the button, by accident, waking up in the morning instead of turning off his alarm clock. But, him standing strong at Reykjavik supposedly, ruined everything. And of course, I would imagine even people in his administration were a little bit worried about what he did there.
Well, at first, at Reykjavik, Reagan does not get a deal that he wants to get, and they leave without. He does get a number of smaller deals, though, that are very important. And what's interesting in looking at the previously classified National Security Decision Directive meetings of the minutes of the meetings. George Shultz went on like a tirade saying, "Mr. President, you got us this, and you got us this, and you got us that," and he listed all the things that Reagan got them at Reykjavik that they already had in the can in 1986. So by like 1985, they knew that Reykjavik was a masterstroke, was a great success. But at first, it looked like Reagan had been kind of blunted.
We have another question right here.
I got a
Great presentation. A month ago, I was at the Reagan Library. Great place.
Yeah.
In keeping with the question that came over there, I can think of two other things that are a little bit black marks on Reagan. One is the '86 immigration bill, which it never really. We're still facing the outcomes of that. And then the other one that was addressed in the library a little bit was Iran-Contra.
Mm-hmm.
You want to make any
Well, on
comments
the
that?
immigration bill, and this is going to break your hearts, Reagan was not fooled. He wasn't out-negotiated. The Simpson-Mazzoli bill was Ronald Reagan's bill since 1981. He and his team had devised this amnesty. Now, the main thing they were going for, you have to remember, the amnesty and the illegals were kind of a sideshow. Their real concern were the Haitian and Cuban refugees that had been dumped on Reagan by Carter. And Reagan was getting a lot of heat from governors, including Frank White. You may know Frank White. He's the guy who unseated Bill Clinton and left him crying in a fetal position after he lost the governor's race in 1980. And Frank White is bugging Reagan. He's in this correspondence. Can you do something about all of these Cubans and Haitians? They're murderers, rapists, mother rapers, father rapers, like Arlo Guthrie used to say, right there on the Group W bench, you got a father raper sitting next to me. Anyway, Reagan planned the amnesty and basically developed it and sold it. I can't find the answer as to why. I can't see what he thought politically that was going to gain him, other than perhaps after the goodwill he had with the Democrats on the economic issues, maybe they'd keep their word just once. I don't know. On Iran-Contra, I alluded to the fact that you have to see this in the context of the hostages. Reagan was absorbed with freeing the hostages, and he convinced himself, with a lot of help from North and these other guys, that they weren't really trading arms for hostages. What they were doing was they were reimbursing the Israelis who were trading arms for hostages. So see, we weren't doing it, it was the Israelis, but of course we actually ended up making some direct transfers. And Reagan made some misstatements about this. He said that all the stuff we delivered could fit in a single cargo plane. Well, we delivered a lot of Hawk missiles that you couldn't even fit in a couple of cargo planes. But it was all done with the hostages and getting the hostages. And, as we talked about in the podcast, a number of advisors had convinced Reagan that there were moderate Iranians, like Rafsanjani, and that by making these overtures, the moderates would be lifted up in power in Iran and they could overthrow the wackadoodles, the Death to America guys. There were no moderates in Iran. They're all Death to America, just some say it softly, others shout it, So that was a big mistake. There's no evidence whatsoever that Reagan knew about the transfer of the money to the Contras, none. And one of the biggest reasons I say that is, if you get involved in looking at these papers, government papers, memos will have boxes down here where 50 people who see these things check them off, right? And Reagan, of course, is in one of these. Reagan's check mark has never been found on any box anywhere showing that he had anything related to do with the transfer of the money. So, I think that's a big issue. I think the Simpson-Mazzoli was a big problem that, as you say, we're still dealing with it today.
We have time for one more question. Somebody has one?
Yes, ma'am.
Right here? Keely, right here?
It's a race. Who gets there first?
Keeley wins. Right here. This woman right here. Right there.
What if she's left-handed? You just insulted her.
Thanks. When Reagan was shot, how close did he come to being killed, and was there any residual effect from that going forward?
He came very close. He lost a lot of blood, and thank God that Jerry Parr, the Secret Service agent, who may have shot him, when Parr jumped on him at the first gunshot and started to push him inside the car, Hinckley's last shot glanced off a metal piece of the limo and bounced inside and hit Reagan under the armpit. So in a sense, Parr actually shot Reagan, but of course he's trying to protect him. And Reagan thought he had a broken rib because Parr landed on top of him. He goes, I'm having trouble breathing, my chest hurts, and later they saw the blood. The minute he saw blood, they were going to go back to the White House, but he redirected the car to George Washington Hospital. Typical Reagan, they get to the hospital, they start to bring out a wheelchair. Reagan gives him that look. He gets out and he walks in like this. The minute he clears the doors, he collapses. They roll him back in. They didn't know who they had. And they start doing all the prep work, and they're going, what's the patient's address? And someone goes, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. They all stop. This is the president. Oh, this is the president. Of course it is. And Reagan was joking the whole way. The famous line, I hope you're all Republicans. All in all, I'd rather be in Philadelphia. And after he comes out of it in recovery, he's still quipping jokes to the point that the nurse has to finally say, Mr. Reagan, I'm going to put this bluntly. You need to go to sleep and shut your mouth and go to sleep. And she puts a towel over his eyes, shuts off the lights, and walks out the door so he won't keep telling jokes, But he came very close. The surgeon took a long time to find the bullet because he said, I've never seen a man that age with a chest like his. He was so muscular from cutting wood and stuff all the time. Residual effects. O'Reilly wants to argue that Reagan had Alzheimer's as a result of that bullet or something. There is no evidence of that whatsoever. They did pretty heavy psychological testing on him up to 92. And it wasn't until 92, after he had fallen off a horse in a ride in New Mexico and hit his head on a rock, that he started to show mental deficiencies. And they tested him at the Mayo Clinic, and they go, yeah, he's showing some problems now. But I think it's nonsense to try and claim that the bullet cost him any faculties. Physically, yes, it took months for him to recover. And you can make an argument that David Stockman nearly pulled the wool over his eyes in a budget issue to cut Social Security while he was still recovering, and Reagan really wasn't understanding all of the numbers. Fortunately, he caught it in time. It gave him something of a bad name for a few days, but that was about it.
Let's have another round of applause for our fantastic speaker, Larry Schweikart.
Don't forget your bookmarks. Email me at larry@wildworldofhistory, and we'll send you a free Reagan podcast.
Yes, he's going to sign your books, and we still have a few more for sale, I believe. If not, go to barnesandnoble.com and get your... Oh, Larry brought more, so if you want to buy some for multiple copies for people in your family, because that was fantastic. I've read several Reagan biographies. I haven't read this one yet because it's brand new, and I've seen several presentations on Reagan. I haven't seen one better than that. I hold in my hand this piece of paper, and the name on this piece of paper is going to win that red bag full of goodies from AM 560, and that person's name is Dave